Thomas stood frozen at the edge of the execution platform, the weight of his decision pressing against his chest. The prisoner below, a man he once called friend, stared up at him, his eyes pleading for mercy. The command had come from Victor, the new commanding officer, a man whose ambition knew no bounds. "Do it," Victor's cold voice echoed across the silent crowd. Thomas' breath caught in his throat. He had known this man's family, shared meals and stories around a fire. To execute him now felt like an impossible betrayal. His hand trembled on the hilt of the sword. There was no going back. The prisoner's voice broke through the silence. "You know me, Thomas. Please." The words cut deep, making Thomas' heart race. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was the executioner, the one who decided who lived and who died. But who could judge what was truly right? His fingers tightened around the blade, and for a fleeting moment, he considered running, leaving this all behind. But the soldiers surrounding him and the expectant crowd made that impossible. The truth was, Thomas wasn't sure what had brought him here, whether it was duty, fear, or the slow unraveling of his soul. As he raised the sword, a voice inside whispered, "There is no redemption." The world seemed to stop for a moment, the weight of the world crashing down around him. After the event, Thomas retreated to the quiet solitude of his quarters. The sound of his boots echoing against the stone walls felt deafening in the silence. His heart pounded, his breath shallow, and his mind replayed the moment over and over. The prisoner's face, his plea for mercy, haunted him. Was it justice? Or was it simply obedience to a cruel, ambitious man like Victor? He paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, the weight of the decision like a stone lodged in his chest. The room, dimly lit by a single candle, felt stifling. He hadn't known what to expect when he was thrust into this life of duty, but now he felt the full force of its burden. "What kind of man am I becoming?" Thomas whispered to himself. He was no hero. He had done what he was ordered, but at what cost? The war had already taken so much from him. How much more would it demand? Victor's words echoed in Thomas' mind. "You did well today," he had said with that unnerving smile of his. But to Thomas, it felt like an accusation. Victor, with his easy charm and cold ambition, had a way of making everything seem justified, even the darkest act. "You'll understand soon enough," Victor had added, his voice like a whisper in the wind. But Thomas didn't want to understand. He didn't want to be part of Victor's grand scheme. He had hoped for peace, for a chance to leave it all behind, but instead, he found himself tied to a destiny he didn't choose. He was no different from the soldiers under Victor's command, all of them blindly following orders. But was that all life was? Simply following orders? As days passed, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Victor's influence over him seemed to grow with every passing day. He found himself questioning his every action, doubting whether he was still the man he once was. He had joined the army with the hope of serving his country, protecting his home. But now, he was a pawn in a much darker game. Every word Victor spoke, every decision made by the higher-ups seemed to pull him deeper into a web of corruption. And what of Sarah? She had been his friend, his confidante. Now she was part of the machine, her loyalty to him fading with every passing day. The knock on the door was quiet but insistent. Thomas hesitated before answering. He knew it was Sarah. She had come to speak with him, but he wasn't sure he was ready to face her. Her betrayal, although not fully revealed, loomed over them both. He opened the door slowly, and there she stood, her face a mixture of determination and sadness. "We need to talk," Sarah said softly. Thomas nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The weight of her words hung between them as she walked in, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to pause. What was left of their friendship? What was left of the trust they had shared? Thomas stood in the war room, the map spread out before him, but his mind was far from the battlefield. His thoughts were consumed with the lingering doubts he had after the execution. Victor's presence was oppressive, his plans for the coming attack relentless. As much as Thomas tried to block it out, He could feel the walls closing in around him. Victor, with his ambitious schemes, was pushing them all toward a war that seemed inevitable. "We move at dawn," Victor declared, his voice cutting through the tension. No hesitations. But Thomas hesitated. The more he saw of Victor's cold, calculating nature, the less he believed in his cause. The war, it seemed, was not about honor, but power, and Thomas had begun to wonder if he had become a pawn in a game that would leave no room for mercy. He had always believed in justice, but now he was surrounded by soldiers who had lost that same ideal. Was there any way out, or was he bound to this war forever? The war outside raged on, but inside, the quiet tension between Thomas and Sarah grew. They had once shared a bond that was unbreakable, but now things had changed. Sarah's loyalty was no longer certain, and Thomas could feel it. "You don't have to follow him," Thomas said quietly, his voice filled with frustration and concern. Sarah's response was distant, her eyes avoiding his gaze. "I have no choice, Thomas," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "We all have our parts to play." Her words cut through him like a blade, and for a moment, Thomas felt the distance between them grow wider. Sarah had once been a beacon of hope for him, someone he trusted above all else. Now, he wasn't sure who she was anymore. The weight of his own decisions, the ones he had made under Victor's command, hung heavy on his chest. And Sarah, despite her seemingly calm exterior, was struggling just as much as he was. In that moment, Thomas realized that the war was taking something from them both. But could they still find their way back to each other, or was it already too late? The days blurred together as the war intensified. Thomas could feel the pressure building from all sides. Victor's plans seemed to unfold with terrifying precision, and Thomas was caught in the middle. He had been given new orders that sent him into a conflict he wasn't sure he could survive. Sarah had become more distant, and their once strong bond now seemed fragile. But it was not just Sarah who had changed. Thomas found himself becoming more like Victor every day. He had once fought for justice, but now he was following orders, unable to shake the feeling that he was no better than those he had once condemned. In the quiet of the night, he wondered if he had any honor left at all. The war, the bloodshed, it was all starting to feel like a never-ending cycle. How had he gotten here? And more importantly, how could he get out? The battlefield was a cacophony of noise and chaos. Thomas was thrust into the fray, his mind numb to the sounds of war. His sword felt heavy in his hand, but his body moved on instinct, cutting down enemies left and right. Yet, despite the bloodshed, he felt nothing. The battle had become routine, just another day in a war that had no end. But then, amidst the chaos, he saw her, Sarah, caught in the midst of a skirmish, surrounded by enemies. Without thinking, Thomas charged toward her, his sword raised high. He fought through the line of enemy soldiers, his every movement fueled by a desperate need to protect her. When he reached her, he pulled her to safety, his heart racing. She looked at him, eyes wide with shock, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. "You came for me," she whispered. Thomas' heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't answer. He didn't need to. Their bond was still there, fragile but real. The aftermath of the battle was a quiet, haunting silence. Thomas and Sarah stood together, their clothes stained with blood, the weight of what they had just experienced heavy on their shoulders. "We can't keep doing this," Sarah said softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Thomas nodded, his eyes distant. "I know," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. The war had taken so much from them both, and now, standing amidst the wreckage of the battlefield, they could feel its cost. They had survived, but at what price? "Victor, he doesn't care about any of us," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "He's using us." Thomas didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had known the truth for some time now, but hearing it from Sarah's lips made it all the more real. "We have to end this," he said finally, his voice firm with resolve. The fight was no longer just about survival, It was about stopping the madness before it consumed them all. The sounds of war seemed to fade as Thomas walked through the war camp that night, his mind lost in a whirlwind of thoughts. The battle had left him feeling hollow, empty. Despite the victory, it felt like a temporary reprieve. Victor's constant demands, his unyielding drive for control, had begun to gnaw at Thomas's resolve. He could feel the change in the air, a growing tension that was slowly suffocating him. The weight of the bloodshed, the faces of the fallen soldiers, haunted him. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. She was becoming more distant, and so was he. Every encounter felt like they were drifting further apart. Could they ever find common ground again? Thomas clenched his fists as he stared into the flickering fire ahead. What was he fighting for? The answer eluded him. The camp was filled with the sound of boots, the murmur of soldiers preparing for the next day, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the war was no longer just about survival. It was about losing everything he once stood for. The tension in the camp had reached a boiling point. Victor's orders were becoming more erratic, more dangerous, and Thomas couldn't stand idly by. "It's not right," he muttered to Sarah, who stood next to him, her face unreadable. "We're not supposed to be this ruthless." She didn't respond immediately, her eyes scanning the horizon. The quiet between them spoke volumes. It was as if their once unshakable bond had started to fray. Sarah, always the voice of reason, was no longer the woman Thomas had once known. "Do you trust him?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah's lips tightened, her gaze turning inward. She didn't answer right away. "We don't have a choice," she said finally, but there was something in her voice, something that wasn't there before. It was doubt. "Maybe there's always a choice," Thomas replied softly, but he could see the change in her. The war had already claimed her, just as it had claimed him. The morning after their conversation, the atmosphere in the camp had shifted. The soldiers were more alert, more anxious. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. As he prepared for the next mission, he found himself once again questioning his loyalty. The war had turned him into something he didn't recognize, a machine that followed orders without thought. But no more. He couldn't stand by and let this continue. His heart ached as he thought about the men he had fought beside, the comrades who had become mere numbers in the eyes of those in power. He was losing himself. "What am I fighting for?" he asked aloud, but no one answered. The silence that followed was deafening. The rising smoke from the battlefield in the distance seemed to symbolize the destruction of everything he once believed in. The cost of war was becoming clearer every day, and it was becoming harder to ignore. The day of the battle arrived, and the weight of it settled heavily on Thomas' shoulders. He stood at the front lines, his sword drawn, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The enemy forces were already gathering in the distance, their numbers overwhelming. But it wasn't the battle that filled him with dread. It was what Victor had ordered them to do. "No prisoners," Victor had commanded. "We show no mercy." The thought of what awaited them on the battlefield made Thomas' stomach churn. He had never been one to kill without reason, but now it seemed as if Victor was pushing him into a corner. As the first battle cries rang out, Thomas hesitated for a moment. Was this really the cause he had sworn to fight for? His heart raced as the sound of clashing swords filled the air. The first strike came from an enemy soldier, and Thomas responded, his sword meeting the enemy's with a sharp clash. The war was no longer just about victory, it was about survival. And that was something Thomas had to come to terms with, whether he wanted to or not. The battle raged on for hours, and when the dust finally settled, Thomas was left standing amidst the wreckage. Bodies littered the ground, the cost of war plain to see. He stood motionless, the weight of what he had just done sinking in. The orders had been clear, but the consequences of those orders were impossible to ignore. "We're just following orders," he whispered to himself, but the words felt hollow. Sarah approached him, her face grim as she surveyed the aftermath. "Is this what we've become?" she asked, her voice tinged with sorrow. Thomas couldn't find the words to answer her. The battlefield had claimed them both, and there was no going back. The war had stolen their innocence, their humanity. What remained was nothing but soldiers, fighting for a cause they no longer understood. "I don't know who I am anymore," Thomas said softly, the exhaustion in his voice clear. Sarah's gaze softened, but she didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The war had already taken enough. The night was still, but Thomas couldn't find any rest. The questions that had plagued him for days now became impossible to ignore. As he sat by the campfire, his thoughts returned to the strange silence Sarah had given him during their last conversation. She hadn't been herself lately. There was something off, something hidden beneath her usually calm demeanor. Her words had carried a weight of secrecy, one Thomas could no longer dismiss. The war had changed them both, but was there something more? Was she involved in something he didn't know about? Victor's growing influence was undeniable, but now Thomas was beginning to wonder if Sarah had been working with him all along. She had become more distant, and each time Thomas tried to reach her, she withdrew further. "No," he whispered to himself, "it can't be." But the doubts lingered, festering in the back of his mind. Everything had become a tangled web, and Thomas was beginning to realize that nothing was as it seemed. The next morning, Thomas found himself alone with Sarah. The tension between them was palpable, thick in the air like an approaching storm. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but his heart pounding, "what aren't you telling me?" She avoided his gaze, her eyes fixed on the ground as if searching for answers in the dirt. The silence stretched between them, suffocating. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice low. "I've made a choice, Thomas." Her words were cryptic, and Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. "What choice?" he demanded. But Sarah remained silent, her lips pressed tightly together. "You've been different lately," Thomas said, his voice growing more urgent. "What's going on?" Sarah took a deep breath, and for the first time her eyes met his. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, just a hard resolve. "I'm doing what needs to be done, Thomas, for all of us." Her words felt like a betrayal. Though she said nothing overtly hostile, Thomas's heart sank. He had hoped for an explanation, but the only thing he saw was a woman he didn't fully recognize. Was she part of something darker than he had imagined? Thomas couldn't shake the weight of Sarah's words. He paced back and forth in the dimly lit room, trying to make sense of everything. The war had torn so much from him, but this was different. He had trusted Sarah, and now he wasn't sure who she had become. He thought of the times they had shared, the bond they had once had, but now it felt like an illusion. What if she had been playing him all along? What if she had been working for Victor from the start? Thought sent a chill through him. He had to know the truth. His mind raced as he considered what to do next. But even as he grappled with his doubts, a part of him feared what he might find. Was she really the person he thought she was? Or had the war changed her too much? It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about trust, about survival, and Thomas realized that he could no longer afford to be naive. He had to confront the truth, no matter the cost. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Thomas had followed Sarah, keeping to the shadows, until he found her meeting in the woods. She was not alone. Victor stood beside her, speaking in low tones. Thomas' heart sank as he watched the two of them, standing so close, their body language betraying a familiarity that sent a shiver down his spine. He moved closer, staying hidden in the dark. "We can't let him find out," Sarah said, her voice cold and firm. "Not yet." Victor nodded, his expression hard and calculating. "We do this on our terms, Sarah. We're not going to lose control now." Thomas couldn't breathe. The pieces fell into place. Sarah, his closest ally, had been working with Victor all along. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. For a moment he considered stepping forward, confronting them both, but something held him back. Was there still a chance to turn this around? Or had they already crossed a line from which there was no return? Thomas approached Sarah the following day, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. He tried to keep his voice steady, but it trembled as he spoke. "Why?" was all he could ask. Sarah looked at him, her face devoid of emotion. "I did it for us, Thomas," she replied, her voice distant. "You're too idealistic. The world doesn't work the way you think it does." Thomas felt his world tilt, his trust in her crumbling before his eyes. "This isn't the way," he said, his voice breaking. "We could have stopped this together." Sarah's eyes softened for a moment, but she quickly hardened her gaze. "It's too late now, Thomas," she said coldly. "You should have known better." Thomas felt a coldness settle in his chest, as if the last of his hope had been ripped away. He had trusted her, believed in her, but now he was alone. The realization hit him like a blow. He had nothing left to lose. The betrayal was final, and there was no turning back. The sound of drums echoed through the night air, signaling the start of the final battle. Thomas stood at the edge of the cliff, overlooking the battlefield below. The tension in the air was palpable. He could feel it in his bones. Victory was within their grasp, but the cost was becoming clear. He had fought for so long, had lost so much, but this would be the culmination of everything. The night was dark, filled with the sound of clashing metal and the cries of soldiers. But Thomas felt nothing. He was numb. His thoughts turned to Sarah, to the betrayal she had thrust upon him. But now, there was no time to confront it. The war had come to this moment, and all that mattered was surviving. "We fight," he muttered under his breath, as if convincing himself. He could feel the weight of the lives that depended on him. The fate of the war hung in the balance, and Thomas knew he had to face it, whether he was ready or not. As the battle began, Thomas found himself at the heart of the chaos. The clash of swords and the cries of the wounded filled the air, drowning out any coherent thought. He swung his sword with precision, but each strike felt hollow. The blood of the fallen splattered across his face, yet he remained detached from the carnage. His body moved on instinct, but his mind wandered to darker places. Every swing of his blade was a reminder of how far he had fallen, how much he had lost. He fought side by side with soldiers he barely recognized, their faces smeared with blood and dirt. But the real battle was within him. Victor, the man who had led them all into this madness, was somewhere on the battlefield, and Thomas knew that this was the moment that would define them both. It was a fight not just for survival, but for the soul of the war itself. In the heat of the battle, Thomas finally locked eyes with Victor. The sight of his former ally, now a bitter enemy, sent a surge of anger through Thomas' veins. "It ends now!" Thomas shouted, his voice raw with emotion. Victor stood across from him, his sword gleaming in the firelight, a cold smile on his lips. "You think you can stop this? You're just a pawn, Thomas. A tool in this war, nothing more," Victor sneered. Thomas felt the truth in Victor's words, but it didn't matter anymore. "I'm not your pawn," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the fire burning within him. The two men collided, their swords clashing with a deafening sound. The fight was brutal, each strike filled with the weight of everything Thomas had lost. It was a fight for more than just victory. It was a fight for redemption. Thomas fought with everything he had left, pushing past the doubt and the fear that had once held him back. But Victor was relentless, a perfect reflection of everything Thomas had despised about this war. The fight between them was more than physical. It was a battle for their very souls. The clash between Thomas and Victor raged on, each blow landing with a sickening thud. Thomas was tiring, his strength fading with every swing of his sword. But there was no turning back now. He had to end this. Victor's taunts rang in his ears, each one more cutting than the last. "You're weak, Thomas. You always have been. That's why you're nothing more than a foot soldier," Victor spat, his voice filled with contempt. But Thomas refused to let Victor's words break him. With a final surge of energy, Thomas launched himself at Victor, his sword slashing through the air with deadly precision. The two men grappled, their weapons locked, the struggle becoming more desperate with every passing second. Finally, with a swift and brutal strike, Thomas disarmed Victor. The look of disbelief on Victor's face was the last thing Thomas saw before he drove his sword into his enemy's chest. As Victor fell to the ground, Thomas stood over him, panting heavily, his heart still racing. He had done it. But as Victor's life faded, so did the last of the hope that had kept Thomas going. The war was over, but the cost was immeasurable. As Thomas looked out over the battlefield, the weight of his actions settled over him like a shroud. The soldiers who had fought and died, his comrades were gone, their faces now memories. He had won, but at what cost? The price of survival had been too high. Thomas couldn't bring himself to feel victory, not after everything that had transpired. He looked at the blood-stained sword in his hand, the weapon that had ended the war, and for the first time, he wondered if it had been worth it. His mind turned to Sarah. What had become of her? Was she lost forever to the war, to the choices they had made? He could still feel the weight of her betrayal, but there was no time to dwell on it now. The world would keep moving forward, and Thomas would have to find a way to move with it, even if it meant leaving the past behind. He walked away from the battlefield, his back straight but his heart heavy, knowing that this would be the last time he would ever be the man he once was. The battlefield was now silent, but the cost of the war hung in the air like a heavy fog. Thomas, mid-30s with short dark hair, stood alone amidst the wreckage. The screams, the cries of the fallen, they were all gone, replaced by a haunting silence. His comrades, those he had fought beside, were now memories. With each step, Thomas felt the weight of their sacrifices. The war had taken so much. And now, as he stood among the dead, the question remained, was it worth it? The price of victory had been far higher than he could ever imagine. Sarah's figure appeared in the distance, her silhouette framed by the fading light of day. She was no longer the person Thomas had once known. The war had taken her as much as it had taken him. "I thought we could stop this," Thomas said, his voice breaking. Sarah stood silently for a moment, her eyes avoiding his gaze. "We did what we had to do," she replied softly, her tone distant. The distance between them now felt insurmountable, and Thomas realized the woman he had once loved was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. Thomas and Sarah stood in silence for a long moment. The words they needed to say seemed to hang in the air, unspoken, as the weight of their decisions bore down on them both. "You betrayed me," Thomas said quietly, his voice edged with hurt. "I didn't have a choice," Sarah replied, her voice almost pleading. "You don't understand." She trailed off, unable to find the words. Thomas could see the cracks in her facade, the toll the war had taken on her. But the trust they had shared was broken, and no words could fix that now. As the days passed, Thomas began to rebuild, both physically and emotionally. The weight of the past still clung to him, but he had learned to carry it. He had fought for survival, for justice. But what had he really gained? His thoughts drifted to the future, uncertain and unclear. "We can't change what happened," he said to a fellow soldier, his voice quiet but firm. "But we can try to make sure it never happens again." The world was changing, and Thomas knew that he had to change with it. He couldn't remain in the past, no matter how painful it was to move forward. In the final hours before they left the battlefield, Thomas and Sarah shared one last moment together. The air was thick with the unsaid, their emotions raw and unresolved. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." Thomas didn't respond at first. The apology felt like too little, too late. "It's over," he said quietly, his tone final. "We've both lost too much." He turned away, ready to move on, but a part of him would always carry the scars of this war. As he walked away, he knew that some wounds would never heal, no matter how far he went. Thomas walked away from the remnants of the battle, his footsteps heavy. The sounds of the camp behind him faded as he moved toward the horizon. There was nothing left for him in this place. His heart was full of regret, but there was no time to dwell on it. The war had taken its toll, and now it was over. He had survived, but at what cost? He was no longer the man who had first entered the fight. He was someone new, someone forged by the flames of loss and redemption. The world awaited him, and it was time to leave the past behind. As Thomas continued his journey, he met John, the mysterious figure who had played a shadowy role throughout the war. John's expression was unreadable as he approached. I knew this day would come, John said. The war isn't over for you, Thomas. The decisions you made will follow you, whether you like it or not. Thomas looked at him, weariness in his eyes. I've done enough, he replied. I'm done with all of this. John only nodded. You can't outrun your past. Thomas walked away, but the words lingered in his mind, unanswered. Days later, Thomas arrived at a small village, tired and broken. He sought no glory, no redemption, only peace. The villagers eyed him warily, but he kept to himself. He worked with them, built what had been destroyed by the war, and slowly, the burden he had carried began to lift. One evening as he sat by the fire, an old man approached him. You have the eyes of a soldier, the man said, his voice soft. But not a warrior. You're seeking something else now, aren't you? Thomas nodded, but he didn't speak. The past was too heavy to share. The days passed in a slow, steady rhythm. But then, a letter arrived. The seal was unfamiliar, but Thomas recognized the handwriting. It was from Sarah. She had left him years ago, but now she was reaching out, seeking forgiveness for what had happened. I am sorry, Thomas, the letter read. I couldn't see the truth until it was too late. You were right all along. Thomas sat down, the weight of the letter sinking in. His emotions were a mix of anger, sadness, and relief. Could he forgive her? Could he ever trust her again? The answers weren't clear. Thomas stood at the edge of the village, looking out toward the horizon. The letter from Sarah had been tucked away in his pocket, and now, as he looked out over the land, he knew his journey wasn't over. The past had shaped him, but it wouldn't define him. The war was behind him, and redemption, if it existed, was something he would have to find on his own. He took one last look at the village before turning away. The road ahead was uncertain, but Thomas was ready to walk it. The world was waiting, and for the first time in years, he felt like he might finally be free.